Hi, everybody. I'm Reed Wilson, founder and editor of Pluribus News, headed back from New Orleans, where I am right now at the Council of State Governments annual meeting. And I'm here with David Adkins, the CEO and executive director of the Council of State Governments. Thanks for taking the time, first of all. David, tell us about the conference. We just had, I feel like I'm exhausted. Several of my colleagues are taking naps right now. It's been jam-packed, nonstop policy. Tell me, what have you taken away from this week?
Well, the activity of the conference certainly reflects the agendas of the states right now. It is a time of volatility and disruption, and I think people are trying to navigate the complexities of public policy issues. And let's face it, legislators are just citizens like you and me, and they're put into a position where they may be one of 100 or one of 200 people that are making decisions about the future of their state. And so I think they are very hungry for the opportunity to do two things. One is to be grounded in reliable, trusted facts. And the other is to spend time with people similarly situated in other states that they can say, am I crazy or do you have these same concerns?
Right.
And my guess is the best takeaway from this will be people who leave here thinking, wow, my state's not as screwed up as I thought it was. But on the other hand, there's some states that are doing some pretty interesting things, and maybe I need to look into that.
Yeah.
So it's an exciting time for people to consider this next biennium of legislative sessions. And I think the agenda is really full.
It strikes me that the agenda is probably even fuller because state legislators these days are looking at a broken Congress that's not doing anything. And I can't tell you how many legislators I hear from who say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z on what may be a federal issue because they're not doing anything.
Yeah, you can call it gridlock. You can just call it the nature of a House of Representatives that right now, has a one-seat majority. The guy we have to feel most sorry for is the Speaker of the House. What an untenable position to be in. But several things that both are concerns and opportunities. One is that gridlock does mean that states are in the driver's seat. It means that this concept of engines of innovation or laboratories of democracy really is a place where we can see what will come out of disruption is opportunity, and how are the states going to harvest that opportunity for the future. And that agenda is filled with both unpredictability and what feels like high risk. If you think about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, these data centers that are popping up all over states, battery plants, direct foreign investment of $4 or $5 billion in a state, thousands of jobs to make batteries for electric vehicles. It's changing the landscape of economic development and relationships with foreign firms that are buying up economic development opportunities in the states. So on the other hand, we are confronted with a federal administration in transition that is promising to cut $2 trillion out of the federal spending, while at the same time most likely going to try to renew the Trump tax cuts from his first term. And so given that, although the economy remains strong, the idea of intergovernmental transfers of money, something that the states rely on primarily to fund Medicaid, but in other cases, transportation, education, even support criminal justice, public safety programs. It's a wide swath of federal support for state programs. Should that dry up, and should the economy go into a recession, the states, while they have strong rainy day funds, would be confronting a very difficult situation, a convergence of greater responsibility with no federal guidance in terms of what are we going to do to regulate privacy or cybersecurity or artificial intelligence? What are we going to do about the electrification of the world to both charge AI and make electric vehicles possible? And on the other hand, not having money that would flow to make those things possible. So I wouldn't say that we anticipate sort of the perfect storm of a realignment of federalism, but it's clear that there are, clouds on the horizon that I think, at least one of our speakers today, Mitch Landrieu, was saying, not making any judgments about the ideological perspectives of these policies, but states need to be ready to anticipate if the federal administration were to follow through on their promises. It would be a realignment.
And it strikes me too that there's something of a generational gap here. The last time we went through a recession, there are lawmakers who still bear the emotional scars from that.
Yes.
Nowadays, we've got a generation of younger lawmakers who have taken over who may not remember those times.
Yeah, it's really true that with about every 2 year cycle, there's over 7,000 state legislators, but maybe anywhere from 25 to 30% of those will be new folks drawn into public service for different reasons than the more seasoned committee chairs and speakers and presidents. And that creates new waves of interest in issues that previously the institution hasn't really dealt with. And when you think about artificial intelligence, there's a lot of layers of it. Obviously, what is it going to do to the economy writ large? What are the opportunities to use it for economic development and furthering prosperity? But frankly, there's a lot of questions about, if you're a legislator, what are we going to do to harness AI to deliver state government services?
Mhm.
And how am I, as a public servant, going to use AI to connect to my constituents, to interact with my colleagues? And I think coming out of the pandemic, there's both a sense of opportunity, knowing that during the pandemic, some legislators just went virtual.
Mhm.
You would have thought that that's not going to work.
Mhm.
And yet it did.
Yeah.
In most instances. They lost a little of the collegiality, but frankly, it worked. And so I think legislators are looking at the institution and thinking about, are we on the cusp of another technological revolution? That the institution's designed to be slow moving, and state government agencies sometimes not as efficient as we would want them to be. Are there opportunities for sort of, incredible growth beyond just incremental?
Yeah.
So it's kind of an exciting time to consider those possibilities. When I was in the legislature, though, back in the 90s, it was the time when personal computers were being placed on people's desks for the first time. And I recall vividly, I can see Representative Morrison from Colby, Kansas, but he was a guy that obviously toyed with, he would have been in the robotics club, but there were like one or two people in the legislature that everybody just looked to because, well, he seems to know what computers do.
Yeah.
And I think that will be true as these younger folks come in. The folks that are still looking for a red box to watch their movies will be thinking, hey, these new folks actually use all this stuff and know how to use it. And so I think it's a time of innovation that will be really interesting.
Yeah. There were 3 AI panels on Thursday and a lunch focused on AI, moderated by my colleague Austin Jenkins.
He did a great job.
I thought he did too. This is not you are not the only public policy organization to spend so much time on AI. Are you scheduling these things because the lawmakers are asking you to? And if they are, what's their goal?
I think we have multi-generational legislators, and frankly, the mind share of AI, it occupies 2 thoughts at the same time. One is it scares the crap out of them.
Yeah.
And that risk is ill-defined, yet it feels almost catastrophic. It's existential. On the other hand, I think they see it as what will move the economy. They probably have NVIDIA stock or maybe Broadcom or something, where they look at their own portfolio and they say, oh my God, this is where the economy is moving. And then we've had 3 sessions. One is, what is it? The other one is, how should state government use it? And the third is, how do you regulate it? And so I think when it comes to the regulation, those who are serious about what do we need to do about privacy? What do we need to do about copyright and intellectual property law? How do we need to make certain this doesn't automate itself in a way that we can't get it back in the box? And I think in that particular case, there is a dynamic at play that will be very interesting to see how our institutions of government are able to develop the capacity to regulate a very fast-moving technology. And I think those who are institutionalists are very concerned about the elusive nature of passing regulations or passing statutes about a technology that by the time the governor has signed those pieces of legislation is almost obsolete. And we've seen in the EU, they came up with a broad regulatory scheme. And we were sort of saying, we may need to go to Europe and visit with people in Brussels about what did they do? How did they study it? What did they agree on? And yet in Brussels right now, they're saying, yeah, we passed all that stuff, but now it doesn't really, it's not relevant to the landscape of what we were trying to regulate.
Mhm.
So we've seen, I'd say the last 2 years, I've always said, when you don't know what to do, you can't get a plan, but you can get a plan to get a plan.
Yeah.
And so the last 2 years, most legislatures have passed the plan to get a plan.
Mhm.
And those reports are coming out now with recommendations. And so what I think in this next year we will see is legislatures processing those reports and determining, are they willing with courage to kind of take that leap and move forward with those recommendations. I think it's a great time for organizations like ours, NCSL, NGA, to bring states together to say collectively, what can we do here?
Yeah.
But it's kind of an exciting time when you think about the possibilities. But policymakers are also very aware of, I don't understand this enough, and it seems like it's a great risk.
Mhm. I get that sense too, that there's a lot of trying to learn definitions and create definitions in the law about what this stuff is.
It's sort of the you think you're talking about it the right way, and then somebody will say, well, generative AI is different than AI.
Yeah.
And you just see them sort of like, what?
You're making me want to freeze right now.
Yeah. And what we try to do is tell them, actually, you've been using artificial intelligence for quite a few years now, but you just didn't know it.
Mhm.
But it's obvious that they are both eager to embrace an understanding of it, but at the same time feel a bold responsibility to regulate it in some way.
Yeah. One other thing you mentioned that I want to touch on, here we are in Louisiana. Just on Wednesday, I think it was, Governor Landry announced a $10 billion data center it's going to be up near Shreveport, run by Meta. It'll be Meta's largest data center ever. You mentioned data centers. I hear the data center conversation in every state I go to. Tell me about it. What are legislators talking about when they're thinking about these things? Because it's not just about the jobs, right?
Yep.
It's an energy question. It's a water question.
The job is the door opener, and they're good jobs. And so a lot of people say, if this technology is going to have fruit to pick from the tree, we want to make sure we get our fair share. It's also true that with our antiquated electrical grid, the ability to sustain this much electrical energy going into these data centers, these huge facilities, will be challenging, particularly if you add to the electrification of vehicles and transportation. So I think what we're trying to do as an organization and have the ability to do is, instead of looking at the immediate challenges and needs, put the pin in the timeline a little farther out to say there are basic priorities that have to begin to be worked on now, whether it's alternative energy that can get into the grid, other options to power these centers, and then try to figure out, how do you bring efficiencies to the grid? How do you locate these things in ways that are both environmentally sound, have access to workforce, and can be protected as a critical infrastructure to break into these data centers and to cut them offline would have obviously catastrophic consequences. So there's just so many layers of contingencies that have to be built into this. And the fast moving nature of AI is such that these will be popping up all over.
Yeah.
And I think there's some that, we think about these space age technologies and how everything moved to the cloud. I think there's probably a lot of folks that think, well, what's the next iteration of AI? And will we really need physical data centers of this size? Or will there be some transformation of technology that allows us to, worry about, will these be obsolete within a generation? But right now it's clear that everyone wants to get their share of the pie. And I think they're worried about, so how do we get enough juice to these things to maintain them?
Yeah.
And my guess is that, like anything else, these new technologies will have some downstream consequences. It's pure speculation, but there's the folks that believe being around high-powered transmission lines leads to a greater cancer risk. There are environmental concerns about, what do you do with all of this energy in one place. So we'll have to see. But
yeah. Gotcha. Okay. Here we are in New Orleans, a fantastic food city. What was the best thing you ate while you were here?
I'm trying to think. I've kind of been living off of peanut butter M&Ms.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
and
do you
caramel
get to,
corn.
do they let you leave the hotel?
But I will say, I have, I was just telling some colleagues that when I was in law school, I got to go to Brennan's for the first time when I was interviewing with a law firm and was exposed to turtle soup. So I will say bananas Foster and turtle soup, unique to Brennan's in New Orleans. I had some of that last night and it was good.
That's a wise idea for tonight. We still got one more night here. So, all right, sounds good. David Adkins, the executive director and CEO, right?
That's right.
Okay, good. Of the Council of State Governments. Thanks so much for having us, and we'll see you next year in Chicago.
Thanks, Reed.
All right. All right, now I'm joined by my two colleagues, Sophie Quinton and Austin Jenkins, who have been hanging out here at the Marriott in New Orleans with me for the last couple of days, talking to legislators, listening to all the cool stuff that is going to be on the agenda for next year. Austin, I think we know that AI. How many AI panels were there? About 16?
Oh, yeah. Three back to back plus the lunchtime event I got to moderate. It was, they packed one day full of it.
There we go.
It's a big issue.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Sophie, let's start with you. What did you learn? What's your big takeaway from this conference?
I went to a couple of interesting sessions. There was someone presenting. We're talking on Friday. There was someone presenting just this morning on Friday from the New Orleans branch of the Federal Reserve, who gave a lot of statistics about what's happening in the economy. It was a good reminder for me to always check in with your local Federal Reserve branch because they have so much data. But she said a couple of things that got some questions from lawmakers. One of the things she said that was interesting was that in terms of labor force participation, folks who are 24 to 55, so prime working age adults, their participation is now higher than it was pre-pandemic. But that younger cohort, people 16 to 24, that their participation is below where it was pre-pandemic. And so it is for folks who are over 55. I think that surprised lawmakers because we hear a lot about the baby boomers retiring, but Gen X is starting to retire. There are folks who are retiring early. And the question is, a lot of these folks, they don't have traditional pensions. They have 401ks. They might be looking at their balances and thinking, hey, I can afford to retire. And it will remain to be seen, whether some of those folks will come back into the workforce if it turns out, their savings don't stretch as far as they think, or if the economy turns. So I think that jumped out to some lawmakers as some data that maybe they hadn't seen.
That's interesting because you and I are doing a panel tomorrow morning talking about demographic change, and I feel like this is I guess I don't know if this is a long-term thing that lawmakers are paying attention to, the sort of shifting demographics over time, but certainly it's been something that they've been paying attention to the last 10 years as the boomers are moving into retirement, as the state budgets, healthcare budgets especially, are just going to be crushed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I think, when I was, preparing for this panel and talking to state demographers, fiscal analysts about this, one of the things they said was states have had so much money coming in because of COVID. We've been through this extraordinary period where states have been flush with cash. They kind of haven't had to think about like the future of Medicaid spending or some of these other pressures on the budget that are really long term. But we really are starting to see state budgets come under pressure as the population ages. I mean, one of the things I learned, when I was researching for this panel is that the oldest boomers start to turn 80 in just a couple of years. So we really are seeing this massive cohort move into these older and older ages where they do have more health needs. And folks are increasingly turning to Medicaid for help with long-term care in old age. So that is going to be something that lawmakers have to grapple with.
I just want to jump in and say the other part of this is it exacerbates the workforce shortage issue, because I was just looking at some Washington State numbers where they're talking about the pipeline they need for high school kids to get something beyond a high school degree. It doesn't have to necessarily be a four-year degree, but credentials, et cetera. And the workforce gap, a big chunk of that is because not enough high schoolers are going to do that. But the other gigantic chunk is the retirements. And then what you've got is this deficit where employers are like, we're going to have all these jobs and nobody to fill them.
That is a constant theme that I hear from legislators. I'm always struck by a conversation I had with Texas Senator Drew Springer about 2.5 years ago, where we were talking about a cool new mental health hospital in his district in Wichita Falls. And he said, yeah, it'd be great if we had the 300 people we need to operate the facility. What good are 200 more mental health beds if you don't have the people who can do it?
If you
So-
build it, the patients will come, but there'll be nobody to serve them.
Exactly. So, and Sophie, I feel like, I mean, we're talking about budgets. I feel like I go to you every couple of months and say, is it time now to write the story that the boom times of COVID are over? And you have been good enough not to tell me you've asked me to do that 17 times, and I've done it 17 times. But yeah. That does seem like another theme
Yes.
coming out of this, is that, you know, those really great years are the anomaly, not the norm.
Oh, absolutely. And there were some folks, Shelby Kearns from the National Association of State Budget Officers. I also heard her talk this morning, and she made a couple of points about that. One is that, you know, state budgets really are returning to normal, and normal means they're tight. It's hard to find the money for things that lawmakers want to do. We're seeing some states moving into the next fiscal year really with deficits to solve. And she made the point that there are lawmakers who are in office or are new to office who have never had to deal with that before, because we've had this extraordinary period where lawmakers haven't had to make such tough choices. So it'll be interesting to see not just how the numbers play out, but how the politics of everything plays out, with lawmakers having to come to grips with the reality of governing with a tight budget.
This reminds me of the Paul Rudd character on Parks and Rec. Who's, like, those are the new legislators who are going to be like, wait, we've been able to spend all this money for the last couple of years, and now we have to cut things. This isn't fun. I
Yeah,
wanna go home.
right.
Well, and we were talking to a couple of
Yeah.
lawmakers at one of the receptions, and you could tell that like the wheels, they were processing out loud to us
Yeah,
that we're gonna, this isn't gonna be fun. We're gonna have to do this,
Right.
but almost like preparing themselves for
Right.
January.
yeah. I think one of the lawmakers, we were talking to someone from your state, Washington, who said that her goal for the year was to like maintain
Yeah.
funding for
hold the
program,
line.
for programs that she cares about the
Early
most.
childhood education
Right.
and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah.
I hear that all the time.
Mhm.
Austin, okay, 3 panels and a lunch on AI. Did you learn anything new? What are we going to see next year?
Yeah, so in many ways, I think we can think of 2025 as like year 3 for AI, because, you know, even though AI has been around for a long time, machine learning has, when ChatGPT debuted at the end of 2022, that sort of, then it came onto the public consciousness and onto the minds of state policymakers. So I think we're expecting to see a huge acceleration in 2025 of state level efforts to sort of corral this or get some guardrails around it. What seems to be setting up is increasing tension around what that regulation looks like. And the most interesting development, I think, at this conference was hearing from a representative of Andreessen Horowitz, which is this giant venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, saying essentially, back off and stand down here. Don't move too quickly because you're going to stifle innovation, and really advocating for moving away from what seems to be the emerging model, which is to regulate models based on risk. And what this panelist was saying is, no, you should be essentially doing a cost benefit analysis, that everything has a downside. But if the cost is better than the downside, then maybe you don't want to regulate it. That's different from what we've been hearing from some of the legacy large players in this space who've kind of been saying, we can live with a risk-based approach, like Colorado passed. So what I'm anticipating is we're going to see a lot of state legislators introducing some version of what Colorado's passed. And I think we may be starting to see a lot more pushback than we have to date on that approach.
And Andreessen Horowitz owns big chunks of every tech firm in the Bay Area, and I think they've got a bunch of Tesla, which has its own AI program. Not Tesla, I'm sorry, X has its own AI program.
And they're incubating the next generation companies, which start out small but could be giant someday. One of the things that the legislators are trying to carve out smaller operators. The pushback on that is, well, if it's a high risk activity you're doing, you're still going to need to hire a lawyer to try to determine, like, what's the trigger? And so the other side of this, though, is that I'm talking to lawmakers who are very concerned that they don't want to repeat what they feel like happened with data privacy regulation, which is where they think industry had way too much say, wrote the initial drafts of the bill, got policy that works for them, but maybe isn't consumer protective enough. These are primarily Democrats who are listening to civil society groups, civil libertarians, and saying, hold on a second. We need a more diverse set of voices in the room helping us to craft this, and we don't want this to be an industry blueprint.
Yeah, yeah. And data privacy took what, 10, 15 years to get off the ground. I mean, AI is not waiting around that long.
It's not. And so in some sense, there's a playbook, and a lot of the people working in AI have worked on data privacy, but we also are hearing from legislators, we waited too long on data privacy. We waited too long on social media. We're not going to wait on AI. And of course, everybody is kind of wondering what's the new Trump administration going to do in this
Right.
new Congress. Nobody's betting on activity or a comprehensive law passing, but no, we should be mindful that this is a new Congress and a new administration, and maybe the conversation will change.
Yeah.
Maybe momentum will change.
Yeah, well, the patchwork of laws is continues until Congress comes in and solves something if they can or will. So I saw a bunch of housing panels, a bunch of conversations about housing, had some great conversations with lawmakers who are trying to figure out new ways to promote multifamily homes, multifamily housing. The alternative dwelling units, that was like the hot thing in 2024. Hot thing in 2025, watch out for zoning reform. Washington State has done it. Florida has done it. I think we're going to see a lot more states that are rethinking the single family home and neighborhoods where only single family homes are allowed. Something you've written about a ton.
Yeah, and I was talking to a researcher again at one of the sort of get together events here who basically said it's not just zoning reform, it's building code reform. Like thinking about, are there laws on the books that restrict like the number of non-related adults who can live in the same house? That's something Colorado looked at last session. We might see that kind of thing in other states, just looking at the building level, like do these apartments need to, how many elevators are required, how much parking is required, like very in the weeds things that can make a difference when it comes to building more and denser housing.
They're talking about lot splitting in Washington State.
Yeah.
I think you'll see, there's already been, I'm talking about Washington because I'm based there and follow pretty closely what's going on in the Washington legislature. They've done some, and they're going to do more, very likely. Can I also bring up, we learned a lot at this conference. I learned something sitting at the bar last night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I ran into this Tulane visiting professor who's in architecture, but he's in AI and the sort of future of robotic architecture. But we got to talking about building different ways of building and modular building. And he was showing me, flipping through, they're now able to build in 2 weeks a single family home with technology. And part of what we're talking about is how long it takes to do stick build, how long it takes to drywall. You can frame a house pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But finishing it, waiting a year when you've got millions and millions of units that need to be built. Now, scaling it, getting it affordable is something, but it was really interesting to start to think about the future of technology, AI, robotics in architecture and building, which could actually be part of the solution to the housing crisis long term. So that was my bar conversation.
Yeah.
A fascinating bar conversation.
I've had more fascinating conversations in 3 days in New Orleans than I have in a year sitting back home. So
There are a lot
no
more.
diss on Washington State, but New Orleans is it's a pretty vibrant place.
There are a lot more fun conferences to come all over the country. Sophie, this is your first time in New Orleans.
It is.
Impressions, thoughts?
Impressions, thoughts. Well, I hate to tell folks this, but I have not left the hotel all day. So we have been, at meetings and meeting people, but we did get out a little bit last night. French Quarter is beautiful. We love, the architecture is so interesting. And I'm hoping to pop out later to try beignet, which I have had in a non New Orleans context, but would love to have the original.
Pro tip, if you're going to Cafe Du Monde, bring cash.
Oh,
They don't
okay.
take a credit card.
Okay, good to know.
Who does
Good to
take
know.
credit cards?
Cafe Du Monde.
Anyway, what about the best thing either of you ate while you were here?
Oh, it's got to be the crab cakes last night.
Crab cakes were okay.
Yeah, you had the French onion soup.
The French onion soup was my favorite. That was
That was pretty good.
That was good. I had a wonderful shrimp dish at another restaurant the night before with some state senators and I don't really like shrimp, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Sophie Quinton, Austin Jenkins, thanks very much for taking the time, for flying all the way down here from your disparate parts of the country. And now we're going to turn it over to our sponsor. All right, we're joined once again by Mark Barden, the co-founder of Sandy Hook Promise. Mark, thanks again for making this event happen. We left off last week talking about the Save Students Act, a bipartisan program that Sandy Hook Promise promotes that's been adopted in Ohio and Louisiana. And you mentioned some of the data that you've collected that shows the number of lives the program has saved. I want you to talk a little bit more about that data.
Sure. So the Safe Student Act basically brings our programs into schools in these districts where this legislation is happening. But basically, in general, even in the absence of legislation, our Know the Science programming, we have trained students and adults in some form or another across the country, in every state, reaching over 26 million people. And the data that we've been able to collect as far as the actual interventions that have been made, that we can speak to, that we know of, 16 school shooting plots that were imminent and ready to happen had been averted by students who are trained in our Know the Science programs and make the intervention and got that individual connected to the help that they needed before it became a tragedy. 16 school shootings were imminent and planned, and law enforcement are involved in all of that. As well as over 700 suicides that were imminent and sometimes in progress when we were able to make an intervention based on students either self-reporting or reporting on at-risk behaviors they witnessed in their peers. So we know the model not only saves lives, but it also fosters a culture. In addition to stopping bad things, it's fostering a culture of inclusion and compassion that we are able to track and see meaningful results in the schools, in the districts that we're training in.
Mm-hmm. Talk about some of the, sorry, I've got a panel here behind me that's cheering and whooping. You mentioned the Know the Signs program. I think that's a really important part of this. Can you talk about some of the signs that you're training people to watch for?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of research on this, Reed, and we know that there are, I guess technically I have to say almost, but almost always warning signs before something bad happens or something serious happens. And those warning signs represent an opportunity for someone who is trained in our Know the Science programs to make an intervention. And so there are a whole list of signs, of warning signs that could be occurring. Not all of them mean there's something imminent is going to happen. But taken in context, we train our students to act immediately and take it seriously. So best case scenario, it was nothing. And, we were able to get somebody connected to whatever services they might need or not, depending on the nature of the tip. But in other cases, it could be a life safety issue. So things like changing in behavior, depression, changing friend groups, bullying or being bullied, fascination with firearms, fascination with violence, acting out in violence, making threats of violence. We see there are lots of warning signs oftentimes on social media platforms where students are the only eyes and ears that are privy to that information. And that's why it's so critical that they are trained to look for those warning signs and then have the tools to respond accordingly. Because oftentimes their parents and their teachers are not do not have access to these online platforms. Or if they have access, sometimes they don't see it. And students are the eyes and the ears for the most part. So it's critical that they are trained with the tools of how to observe those warning signs and what to do with that information, which is usually tell a trusted adult.
Mm-hmm. A part of the bill aims to give educators as well the tools to spot warning signs before violence can happen. Can you talk about those tools and the evidence-informed approach to violence prevention?
Sure. Like I said, we've done a lot of research. We're conducting research studies currently with University of Michigan and other institutions to learn more about this from a clinical perspective. But yeah, we have parent guides and teacher guides so that when a student observes at-risk behavior, they have a trusted adult that they can go to who has been trained. And the trusted adult might not necessarily be their parent. It could be an aunt or an uncle or another guardian or a faith leader or a coach or a teacher, guidance counselor. All of these folks could be in the network of students' trusted adults, so that when a student observes at-risk behavior, either in themselves or somebody else, they can tell that trusted adult, or they can use our anonymous reporting system to get help to where it's needed. But we have a guide and a training module for those trusted adults, so they know what to do when a student comes to them after observing concerning behavior.
Mhm. It does not escape my notice that this bill has already passed in Ohio and Louisiana, two Republican states, and Republicans are they have sort of a different conversation about gun safety than Democrats do. It can be a very contentious issue. I know Sandy Hook Promise has worked really hard to maintain a bipartisan approach. Talk about that. Why does that matter? And what kind of feedback do you hear from the Republican lawmakers who are voting for these bills?
Sure. Early on, Reed, we just wanted to make a difference. Basically, at the very simplest, most fundamental level, I wanted to prevent other families from having to endure this lifetime of pain of having lost a loved one to preventable gun violence. And one of the things I think about with what happened in Sandy Hook when my 7-year-old son Daniel was shot to death is that was somebody else's choice. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an illness. I mean, loss is loss. But in our case, this was somebody else's choice. And I always think about what were those warning signs? What were those opportunities to make an intervention that led up to that horrendous act that day? And all of those warning signs, which there were many, were opportunities to make an intervention. And so at the very most fundamental level, I speak to folks regardless of their politics. We all want to protect our kids. That's universal. It's fundamental. We want to protect our children. We want our communities to be safer. We want our homes to be safe. Those are fundamental human needs, and those transcend partisan politics. And that is genuine. It's not a Trojan horse. It's not a strategy that is not backed with genuine work ethic. I mean, everything we've ever done in Sandy Hook Promise speaks to that transparently, and it resonates with folks. It resonates with gun-owning families in red states who identify as conservative in their politics. And the model works. The model does not infringe on anybody's rights. If you identify as a responsible gun owner, you are already in line with everything that we're talking about and everything that we're doing. So there really isn't any, it just comes down to educating folks as to who we are, what we do, and what we don't do. And they'll understand that our mission is pure. We have a model that works, and it's not infringing on anybody's rights, and it is saving lives, and it is improving the quality of life of the communities that we serve.
All right. Mark Barden, co-founder of Sandy Hook Promise. Thanks again for sponsoring the event, and thanks so much for telling us about the Safe Schools Act.
Very happy to. Thank you, Reed.